People, probably flying in the air is the most unforgiving of mistakes.
Flying is one of those occupations where you're always pushing a little further into the unknown.
We go back a generation ago, we had no radar. We flew around with no radar. It's difficult to believe.
All of us that stay in aviation definitely have that hidden drive, or the maybe it is the risk that attracts us, and how to control those risks. Nobody goes out there to end their life.
It is the kind of profession where you're going to have individuals with ego. This is inevitable. You have to believe that you're able to do this job, and it can be a difficult job.
The general aviation pilot will quite often start off taking a lot of risks. He wants to make the clients happy. He wants to prove himself to his boss. There is a great tendency in that situation to push very hard.
A minimum standard demanded by a government agency is we would like to think, going to ensure that we're not going to have an accident. Unfortunately, sometimes the minimum standard is laid out to accommodate everybody, and by trying to accommodate everybody, it allows a bit too much latitude at the low end, and that's when things start falling apart.
I look upon government regulation as something to be improved upon, not stuck to. And I think everybody should strive to better those regulations, to create an even safer environment. Regardless, they're minimums, and they're to cater for a minimum. You run an operation to that minimum, you run, I think, a subpar operation.
Strict regulations are there to protect and govern a fool, but they're to guide a wise man. And I think accidents are always started from an attitude of either a company or an individual, and that attitude is passed on from one person to another, and eventually leads to, or could lead to, an incident or a disaster.
It's the sequence of events as things break down, whether they be human or, in fact, a mechanical sequence that causes an accident. No one thing will ever cause an accident simply because of standards that are already in place and have been set.
People have to learn, especially in the aviation industry, that whatever they're going to do, they automatically assess the risk involved. And by doing so, if they learn how to handle it properly, then they're carrying on a form of risk management. For really good risk management, I have a saying which I'm totally convinced is true. Risk management and safety, to me, goes hand in hand. And as far as I'm concerned, safety is a way of life.
The public image is one of our main concerns, and I know that it has an impact that we don't want to get on the wrong side of. And we don't know what the passenger thinks. If he sees something that appears to be not well managed, he's going to say, well, if I have a choice, I think I'll ride with someone else, and the financial impact is great.
If you have a good safety record, and if you have a safety officer who is in there doing his job, then you are going to have a good safety record. Then it will be reflected in your insurance premiums. In the aviation industry, sometimes we get so involved in getting the job done that we tend to overlook the safety aspects of it. This is where the safety officer has to step in
Quite often we find in an organization there might have been a series of incidents that have occurred which lead to the final big bang. And to be able to recognize those is important. And that's where having somebody as a safety officer really pays off. And that's where, I suppose, the safety officer's salary is paid.
The company safety officer should be able to pick up the phone, call the president and say, we got a problem. Not send a memo that goes to 27 different people.
This person would be in a position to disseminate safety information without having to worry if he's stepping on somebody's toes at the middle management level.
Safety doesn't come from the top, forget it. What is going to happen in the company if your employees are trying to do something safely and they see the chief executive officer either doing it incorrectly or doesn't care or whatever, it isn't very long before they say, why should I bother? You know, if he doesn't care, why should I care? Safety not only must come from the top, it must be seen to be coming from the top.
Because it is a subject of such importance that it has to come under the aegis of the CEO. That's where the buck stops, and that's where the decision is going to be made.
Consider the pilot's passionate affair with flight, a romance most eloquently described by such authors as Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and as we have recently rediscovered, Beryl Markham, whose book West with the Night described her adventures in Africa in the 1930s. For some like John McGee, it's a fling with freedom, a solitary ascent, an escape from earthly powers. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. But now consider how we fly. It's a complicated formula. Each pilot is different. This is Hugh Wilson, age 37, an architect with approximately 350 hours in his logbook. He has just spent a weekend camping and fishing with friends and is anxious to return home in time for an important business meeting the next morning. He didn't make it. An investigation into the accident concluded the aircraft was heavily loaded and the pilot did not allow for a sufficiently long takeoff path. His aircraft did not clear the tree line and went down in the bush. But is that enough? How? And why did he make such fateful errors? There is small comfort in the knowledge that many pilots are guilty of similar lapses in decision-making. For example, this is Julia Thompson, age 42, president and owner of a small computer firm. She, too, is an experienced pilot who often flies to meetings. Today, she is on her way to a seminar with several business associates. they didn't make it. Investigators discovered Ms. Thompson had been working long hours the week prior to her flight. The accident report concluded that pilot fatigue was a contributing factor in the accident, in which all aboard the aircraft were killed. It's astonishing to discover just how often experienced pilots can forget or ignore the most elementary of flight rules. As in this case, meet Donald McPhee, age 30, a helicopter pilot with 3,200 hours. Despite the fact that his license was endorsed for day VFR flights only, he departed on a flight over hilly terrain in conditions of low cloud and poor visibility. As it was in each of these accidents, according to international specialists in aviation accident prevention, at least 80% of accidents result from human input, or lack of it. In other words, the role of pilot decision-making, or PDM, as it is now commonly known, is seen as a significant determining factor. This has spurred a number of countries, including Canada, the United States, and France, to develop new programs focusing on PDM training in an attempt to sharply reduce the number of accidents with their attendant loss of life and property that occur each year. So this is a program about making decisions, something we do every day of our lives, both in and out of an airplane. For example, you must decide whether or not you'll continue to watch. We hope you will. Perhaps your decision will be governed mainly by curiosity. What are we up to now? Then there's inertia. You've already invested this much energy in sitting down to watch. Presumably you're comfortable and you can't go flying. So why not see it through? In any case, decisions have been called the building blocks of our lives. Some are important, some inconsequential. If you decide to stay with us and watch the rest, you'll learn more on the subject of pilot decision-making and how it affects you personally. Hello, I'm Bill McVean. I've been a pilot most of my life, since before the Second World War, as a matter of fact. I took my first flying lesson when I was 12 years old. I've also been active in broadcasting, so I suppose you could say I've spent most of my life either on or in the air. My logbook says that I have flown over 60 different kinds of aircraft, from a World War I Spad to an F-4 Phantom jet. I've crisscrossed the Arctic in bush planes, flown in Thailand, Turkey, the Seychelles, the South Pacific. Even had to spend a night in a Berber hill village in North Africa one time. And in all that time, I met a lot of pilots. The ones in pretty uniforms, the ones in overalls, the ones in sheepskins, and the ones in business suits. I suppose you could say I've done a lot of flying. Not all of it has been pleasant. In 1975, while demonstrating a 1917 replica Newport Scout to a crowd of 15,000 at an air show, a structural failure caused it to spiral into the ground. I was in the hospital for 6 months. I spent a lot of that time thinking about this business of flying and just how quickly it can become a life or death issue. Hi. Good flight. Didn't break anything. We hear about accidents all the time, and yet denial plays a large part in a pilot's psychology. Denial that such a thing could happen to him personally. We even have a jargon to avoid addressing the issue directly. A pilot never crashes, you know. He always augers in, or he buys the farm, or he prangs, which is a dishonest way of describing a tangled bunch of metal and oil at the end of a runway. Well, I crashed. It's hardly surprising then that a lot of research has gone into the question of why such things happen. What's been missing from the traditional methods of flight instruction?
We're going to use this side of the computer to calculate the differences between true airspeeds and calibrated airspeed.
For years, we've felt it was enough to teach pilots the capabilities and the characteristics of an aircraft and its systems, the rules of shared airspace, some general understanding of meteorology, and stick and rudder flying skills. The premise has been that with this basic inventory of knowledge and skills, pilots will make the decisions necessary to ensure safe flight, and will with time acquire sufficient experience. Well, it's not that simple anymore. We've learned a lot about the mechanics of decision making, enough to know that it can and must be taught to pilots. It might seem a relatively new phenomenon, but in fact the concept dates back to the origins of powered flight, and it's been tried, tested, and championed in various ways ever since. It was Wilbur Wright who remarked that carelessness and overconfidence are usually more dangerous than deliberately accepted risks. In the First World War, the Royal Flying Corps admitted that 90% of its casualties were related to human factors. In the Second World War, pilot selection programs were an integral part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, out of which some 130,000 aircrew were graduated. Similarly, the United States military used psychologists to design screening tests to isolate pilots whose decision-making skills might be suspect. The trend continued well into the post-war era, to the extent that by the 1960s, education specialists and training systems designers were actively employed in military and civilian aviation communities around the world in attempts to reduce accidents attributable to faulty pilot decision-making. In that time, certain training models evolved. Among them, the Cockpit Resource Management Program, currently in use by a number of commercial airlines. Here in Canada, it used to be known as airmanship, essential to which was pilot judgment. For a number of reasons, both terms have proven inadequate. So now it's simply referred to as decision-making, which is a lot easier to say than it is to describe. However, I will try. Decision-making is the ability to seek out and establish the relevance of all available information regarding a situation, to specify alternative courses of action, and to determine the expected outcome of each alternative. And that's the first breath. And the second breath is the motivation to choose and execute a suitable course of action within the time frame permitted by the situation. Well, what does all that mean? I'm reminded of a scene from the movie An Officer and a Gentleman, in which the tough gunnery sergeant asks the cadet why a hustler would want to subject himself to the rigors of boot camp. "I want to fly jets, sir." To which the tough sergeant replies, "My grandmother wants to fly jets. We're not talking about flying. We're talking about character," which pretty well says it all, doesn't it? We're talking about character and how it affects our decision-making as pilots. How do you teach character? It seems such an intangible component of flying. Experience alone is not the answer. A lot of experienced pilots make mistakes. So let's consider attitudes. How a pilot performs in the air depends on ingrained attitudes towards safety, towards him or herself, and towards flying. We've isolated 5 hazardous thought processes or attitudes associated with faulty pilot decision-making, or PDM: anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, resignation, and machoism. Here's an example. You arrive late at the airport. It's perfect VFR weather, and you're anxious to go flying. You conduct a routine walk-around. You notice a small bolt on the ground. Shouldn't you investigate? That you don't reveals a great deal about your attitudes, your character as a pilot. You refuse to give it much thought because as a student pilot, your instructors always insisted on dwelling unnecessarily on such small details during the walk-around. That's an example of anti-authority. You decide to ignore the bolt because you're in a hurry to go flying. That's impulsivity at work. You ignore the bolt because it can't really be that important, and besides, what could go wrong? That's a dangerous sense of invulnerability. Or you ignore it because, well, it's too late to fix it. And if anything goes wrong, that's part of the risk you take when you go flying. A good example of resignation at work. Finally, you ignore it because you feel that your skills as a pilot can overcome any mechanical difficulty you might face in the air. And that is machoism. Whatever has governed your decision, the fact of the matter is you know absolutely nothing about where that bolt came from. It could be an important part, like an elevator hinge bolt. Identifying the 5 hazardous thought patterns is an important first step. Even more important is identifying such thoughts as they happen. Then you need a response. For each hazardous attitude, there is an appropriate antidote. Where the hazardous thought process is anti-authority, the antidote is follow the rules. They're usually right. For impulsivity, not so fast. Think first. Invulnerability, it could happen to me. Resignation, I'm not helpless. I can make a difference. And macho, taking chances is foolish. What this amounts to is a set of rules applicable to the business of decision-making. The PDM model that incorporates those rules is known by the acronym DECIDE. The decision-maker detects the fact that a change has occurred. Then he or she estimates the need to counter or react to the change. The decision-maker must choose a desirable outcome to ensure a safe flight, and then identify actions which could successfully control the new situation. This is followed by the action selected, and finally, evaluate the effect of the action, and if necessary, repeat the process. Much of this will resemble what we've always called common sense, and it's true that pilots are always making judgments about their performance, their aircraft, and the environment. But the sad truth is that most people are woefully inadequate processors of information who stumble along ill-chosen paths to reach bad conclusions, in the words of one author. Well, the DECIDE system gives you a clearly defined set of procedures and should be used much as you use your pre-takeoff or pre-landing checklist. Complementing the DECIDE system is the I'm Safe checklist. It goes like this. Do I have any symptoms of illness? Have I been taking prescription or over-the-counter drugs? Am I experiencing any psychological pressures? Have I been drinking within the last 8 hours? Am I tired, not adequately rested? Am I adequately nourished? All are important. But let's look for a moment at one in particular, stress. It used to be that there was no such thing as pilot stress, or if there was, nobody admitted it. Later, we were told that pilots had this uncanny ability to compartmentalize stress. Well, it ain't so. We could discuss the known biochemical processes or the psychological consequences of stress, but that might still not convince you that stress is real and quite possibly your concern. The current PDM training initiative addresses the whole matter of stress, how to recognize and deal with it, as an integral part of the I'm Safe checklist. As pilots, you should know more about it. And the DECIDE system. Both have been proven in testing. Indeed, the results indicate that pilots, regardless of their experience, who have taken the PDM training, consistently outperform those who have not. And that's why Transport Canada is offering a PDM program. Contact your RASO for more information. It's your decision. Well, having said my piece, I'm going flying. That is, after all, what it's all about.